Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to this week's GRASP Affiliate Seminar. We have we're very excited to welcome Professor Lisa Miracchi from the Philosophy Department at Penn. Professor Miracchi directs the Mind-like Intelligence Research and Analysis, or MIRA group, which is an interdisciplinary research group that works at the intersection of philosophy of the mind and language, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and epistemology. So Dr. Miracchi's work focuses on the role of the mind, its place in the physical world, and how this fits with our notions of intelligence. Her group hosts open meetings, which brings guest lecturers from diverse backgrounds to discuss topics related to the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, AI, and related issues. So she received her PhD from Rutgers University and is an RTY 200 certified yoga teacher and practitioner. So today she's here to tell us more about her work. So please join me to welcome Professor Lisa Miracchi. So Lisa, whenever you're ready, we are looking forward to the talk.
Great, thank you so much, Ani. I'm delighted to be here and to share some of my work with you that's relevant to, hopefully to your work in GRASP. The work that I'm going to present today is largely a synthesis of a lot of prior work that I've done, but it's also the beginning of synthesizing it for a book project, which I'll be working on in earnest next year. So I'm very excited to get your feedback. Okay, so I'm a philosopher, so I get to start with the big picture questions, right? Like, what is intelligence? When we talk about intelligence, often there are multiple different senses of intelligence. There's artificial intelligence in the sense of any machine learning system. There's intelligence in the sense that a mouse might have it. There's intelligence in the sense that humans have it. We can think about artificial general intelligences. There are lots of different notions of intelligence that are being bandied around. So I think it's really important that we clarify our conceptualizations of intelligence and that it can help us study and design intelligent systems. So I think that there's a productive feedback between the question, what is intelligence? How should we think about intelligence and intelligent behavior and reasoning and so on, and how that affects the design and explanation of intelligent systems, both for artificial intelligence, but also for the study of biological intelligence. Now, I want to make the case that we should focus on what I call minded intelligence. So that's the kind of intelligence that a mouse has or a squirrel has. Mice and squirrels can't play Go, they can't drive cars, but they can do things that even current robots can't do. And importantly, they exhibit certain kinds of properties that we're generally interested in, regardless of the particular behaviors that these animals exhibit. So we're interested in the kind of robustness, flexibility, autonomy that even rodents have, for example. And we're also interested in the kind of curiosity they exhibit, the ways that they meaningfully explore their environments and so on. So these kinds of properties have proven difficult to understand and to implement in artificial systems. And biological intelligences, creatures with minds, are our only real existence proofs of systems with these kinds of capacities. And so I think it's important that we take seriously the idea that beings with minded intelligence might have be built very differently and have importantly different characteristics from other kinds of systems. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to explain what I think is different about systems that have minded intelligence. And this is a term called semantic efficacy. In short, the contents, the semantic contents of our beliefs and desires and goals and purposes and so on make up an ineliminable causal difference to what we do and why. I think that appreciating semantic efficacy changes how we should study intelligent systems in both the biological and the artificial case. I'll motivate the need for what I've called generative explanations, a certain way of approaching the explanation of in virtue of what a system has intelligence or has an intelligence-related capacity. And I'll explain why once we think about things in terms of semantic efficacy and generative explanation, that embodiment, and so robotics, becomes absolutely fundamental to studying intelligence. Then I will talk about how, once we take into account this kind of approach, where embodiment and environmental embeddedness, especially social embeddedness, is crucial to what intelligence is, I'll explain how it's also crucial to our normative assessments of intelligent systems. So it's crucial to our understanding of rationality. And how that might allow us to integrate some insights from epistemology, especially social justice related insights that haven't been so far integrated as much as one would like. And lastly, I'll briefly talk about some directions in which this work is heading, where I hope that appreciating semantic efficacy and the importance of embodiment and embeddedness can help us clarify some questions around AI explainability and fairness and some social justice implications of AI. Okay. So what is semantic efficacy? So, for example, Neva sees a pelican, and so she walks to the edge of the beach. The idea is it's what she sees, it's the content of her perception that is causally motivating for her to walk to the end of the beach to get a better look. Okay. So the idea is that the semantic contents, what we perceive, think, desire, intend, and so on, those contents are literally causally determinative or motivating for what we do and why. Now, we have mounting evidence that this is true. So many sciences ineliminably provide semantic causal generalizations. So they explain behavior in terms of the meaningful contents of our mental states and actions. So social psychology, economics, linguistics, and animal behavior increasingly is starting to appreciate the fact that we cannot eliminate semantic characterizations of behavior, but also of mental states in explaining what happens. What's important about semantic efficacy, there are a few things that I think are important about this to clarify about this idea. So first of all, semantically efficacious states are inherently relational. They're inherently environment implicating. So it's your perceptual relation to the pelican that is causally motivating. So these states and processes are inherently environment implicating. They are attributable to whole agents, not directly to subsystems. So it's an open question, what exactly is going on with the subsystems in virtue of which we engage in semantically efficacious thought and behavior. And they're often consciousness implicating, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But often the kinds of semantically efficacious behavior that we see involves conscious affect, feelings, emotions, conscious reasoning, and so on. What I think is important for one of the things that's most important for our purposes thinking about robotics is that systems with causal efficacy have their own goals and purposes that drive their behavior. That doesn't mean that they aren't programmed, right? So often there's this kind of, people put forward a kind of duality between being programmed and having your own goals. I think that these questions are somewhat orthogonal to each other. So having your own goals is a matter of being literally driven by your goals. So it means that you're in states that are genuinely semantically efficacious. How exactly a system could be programmed or designed to do that, I think is an open question. I don't think any of our current systems are semantically efficacious. I don't think that they literally have their own goals in the way, say, a mouse or a squirrel does, but that's not to say that they couldn't. Systems with semantic efficacy perceive and interact with their environments in inherently meaningful ways. That's part of what it means for a system to be semantically efficacious. So they understand, so in seeing the pelican, you understand something about the pelican, and it motivates your behavior in meaningful ways. Okay. So this feature, semantic efficacy, is what I think sets apart beings with minded intelligence from other systems in the world. Now, traditionally, theorists across cognitive science, but also AI and philosophy, have thought that there's something a little bit spooky about this idea. So there's something a little bit spooky about the idea that we're inherently meaningfully interacting with our environments, that if we're going to be card-carrying naturalists, if we're going to be respectable scientists, that we should somehow explain away semantic efficacy, that we should explain behavior without intrinsic appeal to the kind of meaningful, the meaningfulness of our mental states and behavior. So part of what my work is about diffusing this kind of concern or objection that appealing to, diffusing this objection that the behavior of intelligent systems is inherently meaningful, and that these kinds of states are attributable only to whole systems. So rather than, say, internal representations. So by way of trying to diffuse this kind of concern, let me use a toy example of thermoregulation. So thermoregulation is itself an organism level capacity. It is a capacity that animals have in virtue of precisely coordinated underlying mechanisms. For example, vasodilation or constriction, sweating, panting, perhaps even moving into the shade, and so on. These various mechanisms are important to neither necessary nor sufficient for thermoregulation, right? You don't need any one of them in particular. And in fact, you need several of them, and you need them to be coordinated in the right way with respect to the environment in order to get the robust higher level capacity of staying within the same temperature range across a variety of conditions. Okay. This higher level organismic capacity for thermoregulation can itself be selected for. And effective causal interventions at the lower levels for the mechanisms of thermoregulation might not be effective causal interventions at the higher level, right? So one feature of many biological systems is that they violate what's called faithfulness in the causal modeling literature. So when one mechanism is knocked out, another one will compensate for it. So you preserve the higher level, the robustness of the higher level capacity by having this coordination between underlying mechanisms. So this means that the causal regularities that involve thermoregulation are literally at the higher level. They aren't explicable in terms, sorry, not that they aren't explicable, but they can't be stated just in terms of the lower level vocabulary. We can explain, thermoregulation is not spooky, it's not a mystery. But we need thermoregulation in our vocabulary in order to understand how the world works. And the claim that I want to make is that our semantic generalizations of intelligent systems are just like these higher capacities like thermoregulation. We need these semantic generalizations in order to understand how intelligent systems work, how they, what causal regularities are true of them, even if they obtain in virtue of underlying mechanisms that are not semantically efficacious. Okay. So, and I think that just like you can understand how thermoregulation could have evolved as a robust capacity, I think we can also understand how semantic efficacy could have evolved as a robust capacity. So systems that that engage with the world directly are going to be more robust and flexible than those that use internal representations. So internal representations are local, they're context sensitive, and they don't play generally isomorphic roles to the things that they represent. They only represent in context.
Lisa,
So,
could I interrupt with a question? I'm having a little bit of trouble kind of wrapping my head around this concept of semantic efficacy, and perhaps it would help if you could. You mentioned that you didn't believe that robotic systems today have this property, right? So maybe in the context of something like AlphaGo or something like that, a well-known robotic system, would you be able to kind of pinpoint what is missing there? That would be semantic efficacy.
So I hope that some of the slides that are to come will help okay. Clarify this.
Right. Yeah, feel free to skip forward. Yeah, feel free to skip this question and yeah.
Sure, but the main issue is that when you have systems that can be causally explained in terms of internal representations, like many of our current systems, they are going to be able to replicate what looks like semantically efficacious behavior, but only in highly specialized circumstances. You can think of it as, for example, like having only one or two of the mechanisms underlying thermoregulation. So the way that I see it is that what we should be trying to achieve when we're trying to achieve genuinely intelligent systems is we should be looking at how multiple underlying computational mechanisms are coordinated, often in subtle ways with the body and the environment, to get you genuine, meaningful interaction with the world. So a system like AlphaGo doesn't even have a chance because it isn't actually integrated with the world in any kind of robust way. And that's part of why we need robotics, as I'll explain in a few minutes, to help us span the variable scales from systems that operate on indications of useful things in the environment to systems that interact with those things themselves.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry,
okay.
I'm not. I can't switch my video on, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, that answer.
Great. And
addressed my question. Yeah.
Great, and feel free to ask again if I haven't answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So so the idea is that evolution could have selected from systems whose behavior is determined by internal representations that indicate useful features in the environment to systems that end up genuinely interacting with those things themselves. Okay. And so this leads to an empirical hypothesis that there is an important behavioral difference between systems that engage in genuinely relational ways and systems that whose behavior is characterizable as driven by internal representations. So the way that I see it, the task of studying artificial intelligence is the task of designing systems, artificial systems, that can span these variable scales, where we go from systems that are responsive to internal representations to systems that have their information processing coordinated with the body and the environment to span those variable scales so that the whole agent really relationally interacts with the environment. Okay. So why is robotics fundamental to artificial intelligence research conceived done in this way? Well, having a body is the only way that I can think of to get a system to actually be semantically efficacious, right? So at the agent level, what we need to do is we need to dissolve the proximal causal boundaries between sensors and actuators, between what's often called sensing and acting, so that in perceiving, for example, the agent is genuinely related to the thing in the world. And in acting, we're genuinely acting on things in the world. So many current AI systems are completely disembodied, such as AlphaGo, right? Or face recognition algorithms and so on. This means that their behavior must be entirely driven by internal representations. And so they have no chance of exhibiting a genuine causal sensitivity to their environments. Another thing that I really appreciate about robotics research is that it's a bottom-up approach often. So, you know, Dan Kodachek has been talking with me about cockroaches for years and trying to understand how systems can exhibit even some of the capabilities of these simpler biological systems. I think that's the right approach. I think when we try and approach our most sophisticated forms of reasoning per se, we miss out on the ways in which we are deeply embedded in our environments in ways that are dependent on our more fundamental capacities. So an important feature of this approach is that intelligent behavior on the kind of approach I want to advocate is behavior that manifests an agent's sensitivity to what's relevant for her purposes. That's intelligent behavior. Intelligent behavior is not defined in terms of a certain kind of reasoning, a certain kind of intelligent reasoning that happens inside of the brain or the control system. Instead, intelligent behavior is itself meaningful behavior with respect to the environment. I'll discuss a little bit later why I think reasoning can then be understood as a kind of intelligent behavior in just this sense. It might not be overt behavior, but we can use the same kind of approach that I want to describe to talk about overt goal-driven activity with the environment, and also cognitive activities like belief formation and so on. Okay, so to get a sense of how this kind of view differs from a common way of thinking about things, many of you are familiar with the famous Lebet experiments, the Lebet et al. Experiments from 1983. Now, these were supposed to show that subjects have no free will. They were instructed to not to plan an action, but when they felt the urge to move a finger, they should move the finger. And they were also instructed to report their urge to move their finger. So the so-called troublesome data is that there's a readiness potential about 500 milliseconds prior to the movement, whereas the urge to move is reported only at about 150 milliseconds prior to the movement. And so this has been interpreted as an internal decision to move that is prior to your own conscious feelings of movement. Okay. So recently, Sugar and al. Have provided a stochastic accumulation model that replicates the Lebet results, but provides a different kind of interpretation. Okay, so the idea here is that the readiness potential isn't a decision to move, but that you're, especially in the cases of these unplanned movements, you are sort of moving closer and further away from a threshold to where movement is initiated. So the readiness potential isn't indicative of a decision. It's just the sort of slow buildup that eventually becomes a commitment to move. So they replicate the results, but they also explain why in a fairly high percentage of cases there was readiness potential but no movement. Right, so if it's just stochastic buildup, then you would expect a significant number of cases where there is the readiness potential but no movement itself, right? I think one reason why these results have been so influential is that people have assumed that intelligent, purposeful behavior requires a prior decision to act. There's an assumption that intelligent behavior is driven by the right internal representations and decisions, whereas on the kind of view that I am suggesting to you today, intelligent behavior occurs at a higher scale, a larger scale, a higher level than internal representations. And so there's no need to have an internal representation that has that explicit decision. So in a nutshell, intention in acting might not need a prior decision. Intention in acting might be intelligent on its own because it's a kind of relation to your body and to the environment. You don't need an internal decision to make that action intelligent. Okay. How does this relate to robotics? Okay, we're going to start talking. This was some build-up, some philosophy and cognitive science build-up, and now we're going to start talking a little bit more in detail about robotics. I think that when we have a conception of intelligence as intelligent activity, that's not defined in terms of certain kinds of internal representations, that frees us to allow to reconceive of what kinds of processing might underlie goal pursuit. So it allows us to understand, for example, what Reverdy et al. Have done when they when in studying navigation tasks, they use a dynamical continuous value-based system to prioritize motivations, right? So at a certain point, the overall behavior might look like pursuit of one goal rather than another, even though there's no explicit decision to pursue one goal rather than the other in the system, right? Nevertheless, you can understand how that behavior emerges from the underlying dynamics of the system. When we look at things this way, there's no need to, I mean, of course, the systems that we're studying aren't yet intelligent, but there's no reason in principle why those kinds of dynamical systems might not be the kind of processing that underlies intelligence rather than certain kinds of representations that seem to correspond more to our intuitive higher level characterization of our mental states. Okay, so the kind of approach that I just outlined for you rejects what has been sort of the main philosophical framework for thinking about intelligence across AI and cognitive science that I want to call computational reductionism. So according to computational reductionism, mental states and processes can be given characteristic descriptions in computational terms. And so they can be implemented entirely by intracranial algorithms or by algorithms implemented in a control system, right? So this is the view that perception is a kind of 3D representation of the environment, that episodic memory is, a certain kind of reconstructive computational process, that decision-making is the execution of an optimization algorithm, and so on. So on the kind of approach that I want to, that I'm advocating, this kind of collapsing of levels is a mistake. Perception is a relational engagement with the environment. So it's not going to be identical to any internal representation, although internal representations will be necessary, right? Internal representations are like the lower level mechanisms of thermoregulation, whereas perception is like the higher level robust capacity. Okay. So why does it matter to explicitly reject the idea that mental processes are computational processes, that you can give these characterizations of mental processes in computational terms? Computational processes, by definition, can be specified independently of environmental relationships. So at least one influential definition of a computer is a formal system whose operations are characterizable in terms of the formal properties of its inputs, its internal functions, and its outputs. Okay, but if I'm right that that semantic efficacy is what's indicative of intelligence, genuine intelligence, then we have a problem, because semantic properties are determined by our environmental relations. You have a thought about a pelican because of how you're relationally connected to the pelican. So computational states can have semantic properties, but those don't make an ineliminable difference to how the system works. You can characterize how the system works just in terms of the internal properties of the system. So this kind of computational reductionism has been a simplifying assumption in cognitive science for the last 75 years or so. And would that it were true, right? So it's a nice simplifying assumption because you can understand how the system works internal to itself, and then you can overlay semantic content and understand how internal processes can be isomorphic to the structural features of the world that you're interested in. But it comes at a cost. So instead of having systems that genuinely engage with the world themselves, we have systems that are only contingently effective, where you have highly constrained, where they're only effective when the isomorphism between the internal representations in the world is set up correctly. Okay, so I want to clarify something that you might be worried about. So In the past, lots of embodied cognition theorists have rejected any role for representation in explaining intelligence or cognition. I think information processing plays a huge role. So this view is not anti-representationalist. It just thinks that we need to separate out the variable scales at which we study intelligence. So there's the agential variable scale, and then there's the scale of the underlying mechanisms, which will heavily involve information processing. What I want to resist is what often happens at key moments, which is the collapse of one variable scale to the other. So one upshot of this is that we can understand many of our current limitations with and robotics technology if we understand that we're often implicitly collapsing these variable scales when we don't mean to or when we don't always recognize it, right? So if we are trading a genuinely relational capacity for a computational one, we'll get stuck with brittle specialized systems, right? We'll get stuck with systems that work and that often work better than humans, but only for very in specialized conditions, right? So when we're looking for the properties of robustness and flexibility and autonomy and so on, what we should look for is the kind of complex coordination that we find in biology. We should look to explicitly study that. Okay. So the suggestion that I'm making is that the kind of approach that we need if we want to design and build genuinely intelligent systems requires attention to the limitations of any particular algorithm in context, okay? So that we can compensate appropriately. Just like in the thermoregulation case, there will be limitations of every particular mechanism in context. And so what we want to do is we want to understand those and figure out how to compensate for those. This also means that there's an assumption I'll get to in a moment, but there's an assumption that there will always be limitations of our algorithms, our data, and our choices for optimization measures in context. And so paying attention, especially to the social context, the social use of these algorithms is going to be important in their design. We should expect them to fail in certain circumstances just because of the difference between computational systems and genuinely relational systems. Okay, so to take an example, consider this now infamous paper or work by Bwellament-Winnie and Jebru, which showed how biased current technology is against people of color, especially Black women, right? And so part of what this paper was doing is trying to build a better data set that would more accurately recognize the faces of women and people of color. But this was a very famous paper that showed how biased current technology is. I think the point that I want to draw from this example is not the failure of a particular algorithm. What I want to suggest is that the idea that is often sort of in the background in a lot of AI theorizing is that a particular algorithm will do the job, right? And that we can, whereas different algorithms are going to be needed depending on context. So so when we study, for example, face recognition, right? The optimization choices are going to work for only a certain kind of face. In this case, if you run the algorithm on mostly white faces, you'll get an algorithm that's optimized for white faces. This came as a surprise to the community. And my suggestion is that if we think more about AI technology as needing to be deeply embedded with the environment, that instead of sort of trailing the surprises, we can get ahead of the curve and preemptively think about, okay, what are the things that we're going to miss by using this data set or that data set or this optimization measure or that optimization measure, and so coordinate them to provide something that is more socially useful in context. So even if we aren't interested in building systems that are genuinely intelligent, taking the idea of semantic efficacy seriously means expecting our algorithms will only be partial solutions. It means expecting that from the get-go. And so it means proactively investigating the relationship between our algorithms and our data sets and our optimization choices in context. Okay. So let me say a little bit about the work that I've done in collaboration with, one way of sort of thinking about the spanning of variable scales that I've developed in some prior work is this idea that there's generative structure in the world. So just like we study causal structure in the world, where the explanans is causally determinative of the explanandum, and describing causal structure explains how what comes later depends on what comes before. On my approach, we should also be studying generative structure, which is how lower level kinds organize in order to give rise to or generate higher level kinds. And so we can use a kind of the same kinds of dependence asymmetric modeling that we use for causal structure in order to study this kind of dependent structure. So this allows us not to collapse the variable scales of the agential and the computational together, but rather to keep them separate and to model how multiple underlying mechanisms might generate higher level, the higher level explananda that we're interested in. So I've kind of crystallized this as a 3-model approach, where you have the agent or emergent model that describes the higher level phenomena that we're interested in studying. So this would be perception in the relational characterization that I've mentioned, and so on. Then there's the basis model, which involves sensors and actuators and information processing and so on. And then there's the generative model, which explains how you go from these lower level kinds to the higher level kinds, and often explains how, for example, they might compensate one another to preserve higher level robust functioning. Okay, so in the interest of time, well, let me just move through this quickly. So when we keep the agent and basis model separate, then we can and use the kinds of formal tools that have been used in the causal modeling literature. We can start to articulate new hypotheses. So when we characterize the agent level non-reductively, we avoid what's called substitution bias, where you substitute an easier problem that you know how to solve for the harder problem that you really want to solve. So I worry that this happens often when we talk about reasoning, right? When we characterize reasoning in computational terms, we accidentally substitute an easier problem for the one we want to solve, which is the genuinely content-sensitive reasoning or curious exploration of our environment. Separating out the agent level from the basis level is also really important for studies of the functions associated with consciousness. So increasingly, AI researchers are becoming interested in the functions associated with consciousness. So certain kinds of reasoning and decision making and executive functioning. I've been in conversations with Yoshua Bengio and neuroscientist Daniel Seth at the sort of beginning stages of collaborations in thinking about how AI research could benefit from really studying the kinds of behavior and cognitive functioning that conscious systems genuinely have. And so when we keep the agent level separate from the basis level, we can really try and study these functions on their own terms before trying to explain them in computational terms. And importantly, separating out the agent level from the computational level and other features of the basis allows us to empirically investigate what representations are needed or effective for generating an intelligent behavior in context. So together with two GRASP members, Sonia Roberts and Dan Kodachek, we applied this kind of generative approach to the exploitation of Gibsonian affordances in robotics. And once we separate out the agent and basis levels, we can ask empirical questions about what representations are needed for effective affordance exploitation in a certain context. And we demonstrate the sufficiency of some more local representations for some cases. This contrasts with many approaches that assume that affordance exploitation requires representation of that affordance. So if you're operating on the idea that intelligent behavior is behavior that's driven by intelligent representations, and that those representations are the agent level decision or the agent level process, then you're going to assume that you need to represent affordances in order to be able to intelligently engage with them. Whereas on the kind of generative approach that I've been urging, it's an open empirical question: what representations are important? And often the information processing that you need is going to be local and context specific, right? So if we're expecting multiple underlying mechanisms to underlie genuinely intelligent behavior, we will have representations, but they often won't be representations of the whole of the relational affordance itself. They might be what's more locally needed to get the job done for that particular context. We're also starting to pursue further collaborations with my former student, Ben Baker, who's now in Conrad Cording's lab, to study controller composition and its relation to agential behavior. So we're continuing this kind of work. To give you an example from this paper, one of the case studies we discussed is Johnson et al. From 2012. So here, our Gibsonian affordance is that different terrain affords different distributions of effort while standing. Okay, so if you're going to be statically stable, your projected center of mass has to lie within the polygon defined by your toes, and so that requires more torque on some of your motors than others. So Johnson et al. Developed a reactive controller that built a landscape describing the energetic cost as a function of body pose for the robot. They then showed that you could have an effective descent direction towards the local minimum that's determined at every location on the landscape just by the current draw on the motors. So you're using information about the current draw on the motors to determine where you should distribute effort. So you don't have to represent the external terrain in order to exploit the distribution of effort that the terrain affords. You just have to use, in this instance, the internal draw from the motors. Now, this activity, on my view, isn't semantically embedded, but it's the idea of one among many possible underlying mechanisms for semantically embedded terrain exploitation, right? So the point here is that once we distinguish the agent and basis level and expect there to be different underlying mechanisms, we can free up and ask empirical questions that we might not be asking. So in much of the Gibsonian affordance literature, people are not asking the question of whether you really need a representation of the Gibsonian affordance to produce the effective behavior, right? Okay, so in the interest of time, yeah, let me just go through this. So how can we get a handle on semantically efficacious behavior? How can we get a handle on this idea that there's genuinely meaningful goal-directed behavior in the most fundamental case, but in more abstract cases in reasoning and decision-making and so on? So in a lot of previous work, I've developed this idea that we can employ competences to non-reductively, but substantially characterize the regularities involving intelligent activity. So competences are stable properties of agents, and they have structural features that we can use to predict and explain similarities and differences in intelligent activity across contexts. So this improves our causal understanding of the intelligent activity, enabling more detailed agent models, but also helps us to understand characteristic failures. So as is well known in the vision literature, we study visual illusions in order to illuminate the structural features of perceptual competence. So the idea is that competence enables us to understand both the way in which the behavior is effective in a wide variety of cases, but also the ways in which it will characteristically fail. So one main philosophical hypothesis that I've been putting forward is the competence semantic efficacy hypothesis, right? So the same processes and regularities that are constitutive of competence possession are also constitutive of having your own goals, of genuinely having your own purposes and having those guide your behavior as you move through the world in inherently meaningful ways. Okay. So this is sort of the main framework that I've been developing. How does intelligent agent architecture look different on this kind of approach? Well, semantically efficacious states are attributable to whole agents on this view, not subsystems. So we need at least two different descriptions of architecture, right? We need the description of the agent architecture with perception, reasoning, action, and memory, and so on, which may not map on as cleanly as we might have thought to internal features of the system, right? So according to this approach, all of the competences that are described by the agent architecture are themselves semantically embedded. So reasoning will not be causally inner to in between perception and action on this kind of view. Okay. Let me say one thing about how reasoning looks different and how rationality looks different on this kind of approach. So the kind of approach that I've been developing takes content to be central to intelligence. And so it takes content sensitivity to be central to reasoning. So instead of focusing on the deductive case, where we look at reasoning as a matter of performing logical operations, instead we look at the ampliative case, where our conclusions go beyond what is entailed by our premises. This is the vast majority of our reasoning. As Kahneman and Tversky and many other people have been showing, much of our reasoning is not deductive. But it has something better, it's meaningful. So when we infer to the best explanation or we perform curious exploration, we're engaging in inherently meaningful ways with our environment. If what I have argued today is correct, then attempts to simulate curious exploration with certain kinds of formal inference are going to run into trouble, precisely because it's the specific contents of what of our mental states that are causally determinative of our reasoning. Okay. So on this kind of approach, reasoning itself is an embodied capacity. It's an essentially embodied capacity. And reasoning is not a matter of making transitions between internal representations. It's a matter of using what you think and aiming to know. It's a semantic, meaningful engagement with the environment, albeit a cognitive one. Now, of course, there's a serious need for a bottom-up approach here. If I'm right about reasoning, then we have to get a better handle on the kind of purposeful action with our environment that we see by simpler animal systems. So the first forms of reasoning that hopefully we'll be able to understand are, deciding to go over an obstacle or around an obstacle, not more reflective forms of reasoning. But hopefully we can build up to those reflective forms over time. How does this change how we think about rationality? Okay, so in a variety of work that I've been doing in the last several years suggests that rationality can be defined in terms of epistemic competence. This is a kind of rationality that's non-ideal. So instead of thinking about rationality as obeying certain rules of rationality, something that we limited beings can only approximate, rationality on this kind of view is a kind of sensitivity to what it takes to know in your environment. It's inherently embodied and embedded. So on this kind of approach, building rational agents isn't a matter of building them with the right internal representations. It's a matter of building them to exhibit the appropriate semantic sensitivities with respect to their environment. So sensitivities to when more evidence is required, reasoning in ways that are sensitive to features of the environment, and so on. So my hope, and this is sort of future hope for future work, is that characterizing rationality in this way will help us get a better grip on what rationality is for limited systems in uncertain environments, rather than seeing the rationality of intelligent agents as inherently falling short of some ideal. We should study how limited systems in uncertain environments actually do get onto what's important for them to know in their environments, and conceive of rationality in that way. By the way, this kind of approach to rationality helps us accommodate some of the insights from standpoint epistemology and a lot of social justice theorizing in epistemology, where people point out that people have different epistemic competences because of their different lived experiences. So a person of color or a woman might be able to know that what was said was racist just on the basis of hearing what was said, whereas a white person or a man might not be able to rationally form that inference because they haven't had the same lived experience. A kind of competence-based approach that I want to provide both asserts the rationality simpliciter of those kinds of inferences, which are ampliative, right? So there's no deductive argument from the fact that somebody said that P to the fact that it was racist. But often these inferences are fully rational. And so this kind of approach can explain how women and people of color can exhibit genuine sensitivity to features of their environment in virtue of their lived experience that perhaps men and white people cannot. And so this approach to rationality, I think, intersects and allows us to integrate in thinking about designing intelligent rational systems. It allows us to integrate some of the insights from the epistemic and justice literature that so far haven't been integrated. It's also synergizes with some of the insights from the machine learning vision literature, right? We've moved from a kind of Helmholtz style view of vision as the rational inference to a 3D representation of our environment, to a kind of more pragmatic approach of using the representations that work. And so my suggestion is that we can expand this kind of approach to think about rationality generally. In the interest of time, I have a little bit, Ani, I have a little bit on explainability, and well, let me just quickly, these are my last two slides, if it's okay, I'll just finish them. So there are some implications on current explainable AI from semantic inefficacy. Okay, so the fact that these systems are not semantically efficacious, they behave differently from systems that are semantically efficacious, that have genuine understanding. In particular, current AI systems don't have their semantic content essentially, but their semantic content is, they are semantically interpretable. And so one of the issues that I think is really important is that we get clear about how we want to attribute semantic contents to AI systems. So this is a matter of choice here, and I think there are really important social issues. So for example, suppose you want to rule out the use of race in loan allocations. Okay. One thing we would have to decide is when a system represents race. So even though you have labels, the labels that the data are provided with don't have race in them. You might wonder when the system constructs a proxy for race. So one case in which you might think this happens is when a deep neural net uses zip code and education info, right? So that info is labeled. But suppose that it weights education info much more highly in zip codes with lower incomes, right? This might be a proxy for white gentrifiers in certain neighborhoods. And we should collectively make a decision about whether that counts as a proxy for race. Because there's no objective answer, it should be a matter of social discussion. So I think a kind of semantic, the kind of focus on semantic efficacy that I've been bringing up highlights certain issues for social debate and concern. Lastly, this is a project that I've just started with some of my collaborators. This is a postdoc of mine in philosophy, Javier Gomez-Lavin, and a postdoc from linguistics, Andrea Beltrama, and a PhD student at Duke, Hannah Reed. And we are investigating people's psychological reactions to feminized AI. So we're just about to run our first set of studies investigating how people perceive people's perceived gender of AIs affects what tasks they would tend to assign to them and how. And this has all sorts of, hopefully this will help illuminate eventually questions about how effects with interactions with gendered AIs might affect interactions with humans, and how interaction with gendered AIs might affect human social emotional skills. So yeah, that's an overview of my current work that's relevant to GRASP. And I'm sorry I went on so long, but I hope we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for a very interesting talk. I'm going to open the floor for questions. You know, we have time for a few, hopefully quick questions. We can always invite Lisa back for longer discussion at a later point in time. So keep in mind, there is no chat window here, so feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you want, feel free to raise your hand.
And I'll stop sharing so I can see you all.
Well, why don't I just
yeah, CJ, go ahead.
Arrogate and jump right in. Well, first off, thanks for a wonderful talk. This sort of reminds me why I like being an academic. This is really a wonderful way to spend an afternoon. So the question I really wanted to ask, again, this semantic efficacy also plays a sort of central role in the way that you're approaching it. One thing that sort of always bothered me is a sense, and in some sense, I personally think of semantics as effectively kind of a compression mechanism that allows us to refer to a particular state, like staying upright, or you're chatting with your friends, which compromises this vast set of sensory states, but we're able to refer to it by this very small label that fits in language somehow and is now meaningful. And I resonate with the idea that in some sense, a effective way to explain the behavior and motivations is to sort of use language as a way of sort of casting this. But it sort of presupposes in some sense that these semantic category states are somehow predefined, or how did they come to be? How did we come to decide that these, out of all the possible ways of chunking up the world, are useful ways for us to think about stuff?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think for me, thinking about intelligent capacities as, in the biological case, evolved capacities, I think makes me think about them as, in many ways, not just compression of the complexity, the underlying complexity, which is really there, right? But there are certain kinds of activities that we can only describe at a macro scale that were themselves selected for. And so there's the thought there is that it's not random, or it's not up to us even, let alone random. It's not up to us which higher level semantic generalizations are true or false. It's a matter of it's that you have these higher level activities that perform certain functions, just like thermoregulation is the performing of a certain function. And so the way that I like to think about semantic characterizations is that they literally describe higher level forces that emerge out of the complexity of the underlying stuff. And so you can only explain things in terms of them, but also there's more than that, is that they're actual explanatory forces themselves.
So in some sense, they should arise out of goals, and as opposed to being sort of imposed upon them to begin with.
Yeah. So purposeful activity is sort of, on my view, the first instance of goal-directed anything. So the having of a goal is intrinsic to that kind of activity. Yeah.
Do we have another question? So Tori, did you have a question earlier?
Yeah, so I was wondering how situated simulated agents would fit in your definition of semantic efficacy, because I can imagine a simulated agent that so I do robots, so I could have a simulated robot in a high fidelity like Unity environment that would have like true like physics and understanding of the world. How would that fit in this idea that it needs contextual awareness to like reason about these semantic efficacies? Do you have any thoughts on where those fit? 'Cause I can think of other artificial agents that may like kind of flirt the line with they have these environments, but the environments may not be real.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that the kind of complexity we are dealing with when we're dealing with real world environments is at such a different scale from simulated environments, that the distinction between agents that really relationally engage with their environments in meaningful ways and the ones that we don't becomes really stark, where there's a kind of qualitative difference there. For simulated environments, I think the difference is not that important because the environments are simpler. And so that doesn't mean, of course, that simulated environments aren't useful for building systems that really can relationally engage with the environments. But one thing we should pay attention to is the difference in complexity. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it doesn't. To follow up with that, do you think that it would, because you've kind of talked about how these semantic ideas nest almost, or you have different layers of abstraction that you're reasoning over, is it possible that the simplicity would allow for like low-level building blocks of the semantic reasoning, and then you put it in a more complex world and you would get combinations of these building blocks that would allow you to maybe handle that complexity in a more controlled way? I'm an engineer, so I'm like, how do we attack it from like an engineering perspective?
Yes, exactly. And so that's where I'm starting to move in discussions with some of my collaborators, is in thinking about how you compose these simpler capacities to design an agent that is genuinely interacting relationally with its environment, right? And so the thought is, for example, some of the Gibsonian affordance stuff that I discussed earlier, that would be one among many potential mechanisms for genuinely exploiting your terrain. So yeah, my hope is, and this is why I'm so excited about robotics as a way of studying intelligence, is that it allows for this kind of building up of simpler capacities into these more robust relational capacities. And that, I think, is what we really need if we want to get a handle on genuine intelligence. Yeah.
Okay, so we are at 6 minutes after 2:30, so 2:36. I know that there are people who have to go. So please, join me to thank Lisa Miracchi again. Thank you for a very interesting talk. And then please join us. I think the next GRASP Affiliate Seminar will be in first week of March. So please keep an eye out for the announcement.